A rock band vanished over Bermuda in '81. 19 years later, their jet is found. The truth? Not an accident, but a murder hidden by the sea, orchestrated by a phantom rival. What secrets did the ocean keep? The year 2000. 19 years. 19 years of silence, of unanswered questions, of a wound that refused to heal for millions of fans. The Valiants, a name once synonymous with the electric pulse of '80s rock, had become a legend whispered with a somber reverence, a tragic footnote in music history. Eddie Blaze, with his raw, untamed vocals. Rick Dagger, whose guitar solos could make stadiums weep. Tommy Steele, the stoic anchor on bass. And Johnny Crash, the wild heartbeat on drums. They were icons, frozen in time, forever young, forever lost. Their Blaze Across America tour had been a cultural phenomenon, a whirlwind of raw energy and anthemic songs that defined a generation. Then, on that fateful day, the 31st of October, 1981, en route to New York to launch their highly anticipated third album, Midnight Reckoning, their private jet, a custom Learjet 35 painted a defiant crimson, had simply vanished. The last radio contact placed them over the Atlantic, somewhere within the nebulous, infamous stretch of water known as the Bermuda Triangle. One moment, they were there, a confident blip on the radar, full of ambition and the promise of new music. The next, they were gone. No mayday call, no debris, no oil slick. Just an unnerving, absolute silence that swallowed them whole. The world had mourned, then slowly, reluctantly, moved on. Theories abounded: a sudden, catastrophic mechanical failure, a freak weather event, even whispers of darker, more sinister plots involving industry rivals or a government cover-up. The Bermuda Triangle, with its mythical reputation, became the convenient, if unsatisfying, default explanation for many. The Valiants became another of its countless, enigmatic victims. Until now, the deep-sea research vessel, USNS Pathfinder, wasn't looking for ghosts. Its crew, a collection of seasoned oceanographers and naval technicians, were conducting routine sonar mapping of the Blake Plateau, a deep ocean terrace off the southeastern United States. It was tedious work, the rhythmic ping of the sonar a monotonous soundtrack to their days. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Thorne, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun and sea, was overseeing the data feed in the dimly lit operations room. He'd seen 1,000 anomalies on the seabed, geological formations, forgotten shipwrecks, the occasional whale carcass. But this was different. The sonar image painted a jagged silhouette against the otherwise featureless abyssal plain, nearly 2 miles beneath the waves. It was too angular for a rock, too small for a known commercial wreck, yet undeniably man-made. Magnify Sector G7, Thorne's voice, calm but edged with curiosity, cut through the low hum of the equipment. The image sharpened. A fuselage, mostly intact despite the crushing pressure and decades of corrosion. A tail, twin-engine mounts, now hollow sockets. What truly caught his attention, however, was a faint, almost imperceptible detail along the corroded flank. A series of distinctive, elongated oval windows, a design feature often favored in luxury private jets of a certain era. A ripple of unease, an almost forgotten memory, stirred in Thorne. He'd been a teenager when the Valiants disappeared, a fan of their rebellious energy. He remembered the posters, the headlines, the pervasive sense of loss. "Run a comparison," Thorne ordered, his voice now tighter. "Cross-reference with aviation databases for missing aircraft. 1970s, 1980s, private jets, twin-engine, tail configuration. Specifically, check for anything linked to a band, the Valiants." The younger technician beside him, a fresh-faced ensign named Miller, looked up, a question in his eyes. "The Valiants, sir. The rock band." "The very same," Thorne replied, his gaze fixed on the ghostly image on the screen. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The database churned through decades of lost flights. Then, a match. A single stark entry. Learjet 35, registration N400VX, owner, Valiant Enterprises, Inc. Last known position, eerily close to their current coordinates. A collective intake of breath seemed to suck the air from the room. On the screen, a faded color photograph accompanying the aircraft's file showed a gleaming crimson jet, its tail emblazoned with the band's iconic logo, a stylized phoenix rising from flames. Even through the digital distortion and years of decay, the lines of the wreckage on the ocean floor were an undeniable match. The news, when it broke, was not a gentle ripple but a tidal wave. The Valiant's jet found. After 19 years, the ocean had decided to give up one of its secrets. For the families, for the fans, for the investigators who had long since closed the case, it was a resurrection of ghosts, a reopening of old wounds, but also, crucially, a spark of hope for answers, for closure, for the truth of what happened on that Halloween night in 1981. The silence had been broken, not by a sound, but by an image from the deep, and with it, a profound, unsettling question echoed around the world. What secrets did that mangled wreck, resting in the crushing darkness for nearly 2 decades, still hold? The discovery was not an ending, but a shocking, unexpected new beginning to a mystery everyone thought was long dead and buried. The deep sea had preserved more than just twisted metal. It had preserved a question, now demanding to be answered. The Valiants were more than just a band. They were a vibrant, volatile cocktail of talent, ambition, and youthful rebellion that had captured the zeitgeist of the early 1980s. Their music was a sonic tapestry woven from Eddie Blaze's soul-stirring vocals, Rick Dagger's searing guitar riffs, Tommy Steele's grounding bass lines, and Johnny Crash's thunderous, almost unhinged drumming. Each member was a crucial element, a distinct personality whose individual spark contributed to the band's incandescent glow. Eddie Blaze, born Edward Blazakowski in the blue-collar suburbs of Cleveland, was the reluctant frontman. He possessed a raw, almost primal vocal power that could shift from a guttural roar to a tender caress in a single breath. On stage, he was a magnetic force, all coiled energy and restless pacing, his lyrics often introspective and laced with a poetic cynicism that belied his 24 years. Off-stage, however, Eddie was surprisingly reserved, often found with a dog-eared poetry book rather than a bottle of whiskey. He was the soul of the Valiants, his words giving voice to a generation grappling with uncertainty and a yearning for something more. His last known photograph, a candid shot taken at the airport before their final flight, showed him with a half smile, a guitar case slung over his shoulder, the collar of his leather jacket turned up against a non-existent chill. It was an image of cool defiance, now forever etched in the public memory as a symbol of lost promise. What was lost with Eddie was not just a voice, but a poet who was only beginning to find his most powerful verses. Rick Dagger, real name Ricardo Diaz, was the band's musical architect and lead guitarist. A virtuoso from a young age, hailing from the sun-drenched streets of Los Angeles, Rick could make his Gibson Les Paul sing, scream, or cry. His solos were legendary, intricate, blistering, and emotionally charged. He was the showman, the flamboyant counterpoint to Eddie's brooding intensity. With a bandana invariably tied around his forehead, fingers a blur on the fretboard, he was the embodiment of rock and roll swagger. Rick was the driving force behind the band's evolving sound, constantly pushing them to experiment, to break new ground. He had been particularly excited about Midnight Reckoning, their upcoming album, which he had described in his last interview as a journey into the heart of darkness, but with a flashlight and a killer soundtrack. With Rick's disappearance, the music world lost an innovator, a guitarist whose potential seemed limitless, whose signature sound was just beginning to fully mature. The unplayed riffs, the unfinished compositions, represented an entire library of music that would never be heard. Tommy Steele, born Thomas Stillman in rural Georgia, was the band's quiet anchor on bass. Tall, lanky, and often sporting a thoughtful expression, Tommy was the grounding force both musically and personally. His bass lines were not flashy, but they were the bedrock upon which Eddie's vocals and Rick's pyrotechnics could soar. He was the mediator, the calm presence in the occasional storms of creative differences or the pressures of fame. Tommy was also a gifted photographer, his Leica camera, a constant companion, capturing candid moments of the band's life on the road, the boredom, the camaraderie, the fleeting instances of vulnerability. His visual diary of the Valiants, had it ever been fully compiled and published, would have been a unique and intimate portrait. The loss of Tommy was the loss of the band's steady heartbeat, its quiet observer, the one who held them together when the whirlwind of their rapid ascent threatened to tear them apart. His unseen photographs, like their unreleased music, became another layer of the enigma. And then there was Johnny Crash, born Jonathan Krasinski in Queens, New York. True to his moniker, Johnny was the wild card, the explosive energy behind the drum kit. His drumming was a force of nature, powerful, unpredictable, and relentlessly inventive. He was the jester, the provocateur, always ready with a wisecrack or a prank, his infectious energy lifting the spirits of his bandmates during grueling tours. Yet, beneath the boisterous exterior was a keen intellect and a surprising sensitivity. He was fiercely loyal to his bandmates, seeing them as the brothers he never had. Johnny had been particularly looking forward to playing Madison Square Garden, a homecoming that was meant to be the triumphant culmination of their Blaze Across America tour. With Johnny's death, the raw, untamed spirit of the Valiants was extinguished. The driving rhythm that propelled their anthems, the rebellious crash of cymbals that punctuated their defiance, fell silent. What was lost was not just four young men on the cusp of international superstardom. It was the music they had yet to create, the stadium anthems they would never perform, the evolution of a sound that had already captivated millions. Midnight Reckoning, their lost album, became the holy grail for their fans. Tapes were rumored to exist, master recordings locked away in a vault, but without the band to shepherd it, to breathe life into it, it remained a tantalizing spectre. Their disappearance ripped a hole in the fabric of the music scene. Other bands rose to fill the void, but none quite captured that unique blend of raw talent, poetic depth, and youthful exuberance that defined the Valiants. The impact was profound and lasting. Their existing two albums posthumously achieved legendary status, their sales soaring as a new generation discovered their music, drawn in by the mystique and the tragedy. Vigils were held, tribute bands formed, and their songs became anthems of remembrance. But for those who had lived through their brief, incandescent reign, there was always the gnawing question of what if. What if their journey hadn't been so tragically cut short? What masterpieces were silenced in the cold, crushing depths of the Atlantic? The Crimson Learjet N400VX wasn't just carrying four musicians and their crew, it was carrying dreams, aspirations, and a future sound. It carried Eddie's unfinished lyric book, Rick's new guitar effects pedals he was eager to try, rolls of Tommy's undeveloped film, and Johnny's lucky drumsticks, already splintered from a pre-tour rehearsal. These weren't just objects. They were extensions of the men themselves, symbols of their art and their lives. The discovery of the wreckage, while a shock, brought with it the faintest, most painful glimmer of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, some of these lost pieces, some tangible connection to the men and their final moments, might be recovered. The ocean had held them for 19 years. Now, it was time to see what, if anything, it was willing to give back beyond the twisted metal of their tomb. The loss was immeasurable, a symphony silenced before its crescendo, leaving an enduring echo of what might have been. The Valiants were more than just a band. They were a vibrant, volatile cocktail of talent, ambition, and youthful rebellion that had captured the zeitgeist of the early 1980s. Their music was a sonic tapestry woven from Eddie Blaze's soul-stirring vocals, Rick Dagger's searing guitar riffs, Tommy Steele's grounding bass lines, and Johnny Crash's thunderous, almost unhinged drumming. Each member was a crucial element, a distinct personality whose individual spark contributed to the band's incandescent glow. Eddie Blaze, born Edward Blazakowski in the blue-collar suburbs of Cleveland, was the reluctant frontman. He possessed a raw, almost primal vocal power that could shift from a guttural roar to a tender caress in a single breath. On stage, he was a magnetic force, all coiled energy and restless pacing, his lyrics often introspective and laced with a poetic cynicism that belied his 24 years. Offstage, however, Eddie was surprisingly reserved, often found with a dog-eared poetry book rather than a bottle of whiskey. He was the soul of the Valiants, his words giving voice to a generation grappling with uncertainty and a yearning for something more. His last known photograph, a candid shot taken at the airport before their final flight, showed him with a half-smile, a guitar case slung over his shoulder, the collar of his leather jacket turned up against a non-existent chill. It was an image of cool defiance, now forever etched in the public memory as a symbol of lost promise. What was lost with Eddie was not just a voice, but a poet who was only beginning to find his most powerful verses. Rick Dagger, real name Ricardo Diaz, was the band's musical architect and lead guitarist. A virtuoso from a young age, hailing from the sun-drenched streets of Los Angeles, Rick could make his Gibson Les Paul sing, scream, or cry. His solos were legendary, intricate, blistering, and emotionally charged. He was the showman, the flamboyant counterpoint to Eddie's brooding intensity. With a bandana invariably tied around his forehead, fingers a blur on the fretboard, he was the embodiment of rock and roll swagger. Rick was the driving force behind the band's evolving sound, constantly pushing them to experiment, to break new ground. He had been particularly excited about Midnight Reckoning, their upcoming album, which he had described in his last interview as a journey into the heart of darkness, but with a flashlight and a killer soundtrack. With Rick's disappearance, the music world lost an innovator, a guitarist whose potential seemed limitless, whose signature sound was just beginning to fully mature. The unplayed riffs, the unfinished compositions, represented an entire library of music that would never be heard. Tommy Steele, born Thomas Stillman in rural Georgia, was the band's quiet anchor on bass. Tall, lanky, and often sporting a thoughtful expression, Tommy was the grounding force both musically and personally. His bass lines were not flashy, but they were the bedrock upon which Eddie's vocals and Rick's pyrotechnics could soar. He was the mediator, the calm presence in the occasional storms of creative differences or the pressures of fame. Tommy was also a gifted photographer, his Leica camera, a constant companion, capturing candid moments of the band's life on the road, the boredom, the camaraderie, the fleeting instances of vulnerability. His visual diary of the Valiants, had it ever been fully compiled and published, would have been a unique and intimate portrait. The loss of Tommy was the loss of the band's steady heartbeat, its quiet observer, the one who held them together when the whirlwind of their rapid ascent threatened to tear them apart. His unseen photographs, like their unreleased music, became another layer of the enigma. And then there was Johnny Crash, born Jonathan Krasinski in Queens, New York. True to his moniker, Johnny was the wild card, the explosive energy behind the drum kit. His drumming was a force of nature, powerful, unpredictable, and relentlessly inventive. He was the jester, the provocateur, always ready with a wisecrack or a prank, his infectious energy lifting the spirits of his bandmates during grueling tours. Yet, beneath the boisterous exterior was a keen intellect and a surprising sensitivity. He was fiercely loyal to his bandmates, seeing them as the brothers he never had. Johnny had been particularly looking forward to playing Madison Square Garden, a homecoming that was meant to be the triumphant culmination of their Blaze Across America tour. With Johnny's death, the raw, untamed spirit of the Valiants was extinguished. The driving rhythm that propelled their anthems, the rebellious crash of cymbals that punctuated their defiance, fell silent. What was lost was not just four young men, on the cusp of international superstardom. It was the music they had yet to create, the stadium anthems they would never perform, the evolution of a sound that had already captivated millions. Midnight Reckoning, their lost album, became the holy grail for their fans. Tapes were rumored to exist, master recordings locked away in a vault, but without the band to shepherd it, to breathe life into it, it remained a tantalizing specter. Their disappearance ripped a hole in the fabric of the music scene. Other bands rose to fill the void, but none quite captured that unique blend of raw talent, poetic depth, and youthful exuberance that defined the Valiants. The impact was profound and lasting. Their existing two albums posthumously achieved legendary status, their sales soaring as a new generation discovered their music, drawn in by the mystique and the tragedy. Vigils were held, tribute bands formed, and their songs became anthems of remembrance. But for those who had lived through their brief incandescent reign, there was always the gnawing question of what if. What if their journey hadn't been so tragically cut short? What masterpieces were silenced in the cold, crushing depths of the Atlantic? The Crimson Learjet, N400VX, wasn't just carrying four musicians and their crew, it was carrying dreams, aspirations, and a future sound. It carried Eddie's unfinished lyric book, Rick's new guitar effects pedals he was eager to try, rolls of Tommy's undeveloped film, and Johnny's lucky drumsticks, already splintered from a pre-tour rehearsal. These weren't just objects, they were extensions of the men themselves, symbols of their art and their lives. The discovery of the wreckage, while a shock, brought with it the faintest, most painful glimmer of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, some of these lost pieces, some tangible connection to the men and their final moments, might be recovered. The ocean had held them for 19 years. Now, it was time to see what, if anything, it was willing to give back beyond the twisted metal of their tomb. The loss was immeasurable, a symphony silenced before its crescendo, leaving an enduring echo of what might have been. The initial announcement of the USNS Pathfinder's discovery sent a jolt through the aging infrastructure of officialdom and the music industry. Institutions that had long since filed the Valiants under tragic, unsolved, and ultimately closed. In 1981, the response to the jet's disappearance had been swift, but many argued, unsatisfyingly shallow. The Bermuda Triangle, a convenient scapegoat, had been invoked almost immediately, casting a pall of insurmountable mystery over the event. This narrative, eagerly amplified by a media hungry for sensational headlines, effectively dampened calls for a more exhaustive, prolonged search or a deeper investigation into potential mechanical failures or other, less palatable possibilities. The official investigation, spearheaded by the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, and the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, concluded within 18 months. The final report, a document running to a slim 72 pages, cited cause unknown, aircraft presumed lost at sea in an area notorious for unexplained disappearances. There were perfunctory mentions of checking maintenance logs, which were found to be in order, weather reports, scattered squalls but nothing a Learjet couldn't handle, and pilot qualifications, impeccable. But the bulk of the report seemed to dwell on the intractability of searching such a vast, deep expanse of ocean, especially without a precise last known position or any debris. The subtext was clear. It was a tragic accident, amplified by its geographical unfortunate location, and further resources were unlikely to yield results. The case was administratively closed. For the families of Eddie, Rick, Tommy, and Johnny, and the two-person flight crew, pilot Captain Don Pierce and co-pilot Sarah Evans, this conclusion felt like a second abandonment. Maria Blazakowski, Eddie's younger sister, now a quiet, determined woman in her late 30s, had been only a teenager when her brother vanished. She remembered the whirlwind of condescending sympathy, the officials who spoke in hushed tones about the mysteries of the sea, and the record label executives who, while publicly lamenting the loss, quickly moved to compile a greatest hits package that sold millions. They wrote them off, Maria had said in a rare interview years later. It was easier to call it an unsolvable enigma than to admit they didn't know, or perhaps didn't look hard enough. Her small apartment was a shrine to Eddie, not of rock stardom, but of brotherhood, photographs, old letters, a worn teddy bear he'd won for her at a fair. For her, the discovery of the jet was a vindication of a grief that had never accepted the official narrative's shrug of resignation. Galaxy Records, the Valiant's label, had initially expressed profound shock and sorrow in 1981. Their charismatic, if somewhat ruthless, CEO, Marcus Thorne Sr., no relation to the naval commander, had given a tearful press conference. Yet within weeks, the label's marketing department went into overdrive. Lost legends. The Valiant story documentaries were rushed into production. Limited edition vinyls with previously unreleased B-sides, often just slightly different demo takes, appeared in record stores. The tragedy, however genuine the initial shock, had undeniably profitable aftershocks. The band, in death, became even more mythical, their existing work imbued with a tragic glamour. Now, in 2000, with Marcus Thorne Jr. at the helm of Galaxy Records, the response was more polished, more corporate, but with an underlying current that felt unsettlingly familiar to those who remembered the first time around. A press release was issued within hours of the Navy confirming the jet's identity. Galaxy Records is profoundly moved by the recent discovery, it read. Our hearts go out to the families. The Valiants were a unique and irreplaceable talent. We hope this discovery brings some measure of closure. We will, of course, cooperate fully with any ensuing investigation and are already exploring ways to appropriately honor their memory in light of these developments. Behind the scenes, however, phone calls were already being made. Was Midnight Reckoning, the lost album, recoverable? Could the master tapes, rumored to be in a secure vault, finally be released, perhaps with a deluxe edition including a documentary about the wreck's discovery. The cogs of commerce, momentarily stilled by the news, were beginning to whir again. The official response from the NTSB in 2000 was cautious. Spokesperson Charles Rourke, a man adept at navigating bureaucratic minefields, stated, "We are aware of the discovery. We will be liaising with the U.S. Navy to assess the feasibility and utility of a recovery operation for investigative purposes. It's important to remember the extreme depth and the passage of time. However, any new evidence will, of course, be thoroughly evaluated." There was no immediate talk of reopening the old case file, no public admission that perhaps the initial investigation had been too hastily concluded. The system, it seemed, was wary of dredging up its own past, of facing questions about its own thoroughness 19 years prior. One man who watched these developments with a cynical eye was retired FAA investigator Frank Holloway. Holloway, in his late 60s, had been a junior investigator on the original Valiance case. He'd always felt uneasy about the swiftness of its closure, the almost eager embrace of the Bermuda Triangle theory. He'd privately believed a catastrophic equipment failure, perhaps an uncontained engine fire or an electrical fault, was more likely, but his superiors had been keen to wrap things up. The lack of debris near the surface had always bothered him. Planes don't just evaporate, he'd muttered to his wife back then. Now, hearing the news, he pulled out his old, unofficial notes from a dusty box in his garage. One particular item stood out, a briefly mentioned, then dismissed, report from a freighter that had been 100 miles south of the jet's presumed flight path. They'd reported seeing a faint, inexplicable flare in the sky on the night of the 31st of October, 1981, in the general direction of Bermuda. It had been discounted as unrelated, too distant, too vague. Holloway now wondered. The public reaction, fueled by a 24/7 news cycle unimaginable in 1981, was a maelstrom of renewed grief, nostalgia, and rampant speculation. Online forums buzzed with theories, old and new. Was it really just an accident? Could the mangled fuselage finally tell the tale? Yet underneath the clamor, there was a palpable sense that the system, be it governmental agencies or corporate entities, had, in its past and perhaps even in its present, treated the loss of the Valiants and their crew with a degree of expediency that bordered on indifference once the initial shock wore off. The discovery of the jet was not just about finding a lost aircraft, it was about confronting nearly 2 decades of accepted silence, of questions left unasked, of a truth that might have been buried not just by water and time, but by a systemic reluctance to look too closely. The rust on the recovered fuselage was a physical reality. The rust of indifference was a more insidious, more deeply embedded corrosion. The decision to attempt a partial recovery of the Learjet's wreckage was fraught with technical challenges and bureaucratic debate. The depth, nearly 2 miles down, meant that any operation would be incredibly complex and expensive. Public pressure, however, fueled by relentless media coverage and the unwavering determination of the families, particularly Maria Blazakowski, eventually tipped the scales. The USNS Pathfinder, equipped with a remotely operated vehicle, ROV, named DeepScan, was tasked with the delicate operation. The primary targets were the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, the flight data recorder, FDR, the so-called black boxes, and any section of the fuselage that might offer clues about the jet's final moments. There was also a morbid, unspoken hope of recovering personal effects, anything that could provide a tangible link to those lost. As DeepScan descended into the crushing darkness, its powerful lights cutting swaths through the inky black, the world watched via live satellite feeds, a grim vigil. The first images of the wreckage up close were haunting. The crimson paint was almost entirely gone, consumed by decades of submersion, leaving behind a ghostly, corroded metal shell. The distinctive oval windows were like vacant eyes, staring into the abyss. One wing was sheared off, the other bent at an unnatural angle. The tail section, surprisingly, was relatively intact, still bearing a barely discernible, ghostly outline of the Valiant's Phoenix logo. Frank Holloway, the retired FAA investigator, found himself an unlikely consultant to the NTSB's newly reopened, albeit tentative, inquiry. His old notes, particularly the mention of the freighter's flare sighting, had gained new traction. He sat in the Mission Control Center, a cramped room filled with screens displaying DeepScan's telemetry and video feeds, his presence a quiet testament to a hunch that had gnawed at him for 19 years. The ROV's manipulators, guided with painstaking precision, first located the flight data recorder, its orange casing surprisingly resistant to the ravages of the deep. It was carefully secured in a recovery basket. Hours later, after a meticulous search through the mangled forward section, the cockpit voice recorder was also found, lodged near the co-pilot's crumpled seat. The recovery of these two small, incredibly dense objects sent a wave of anticipation and trepidation through everyone involved. They held the potential for answers, for the raw, unfiltered truth of Flight N400VX's final minutes. While the black boxes were being slowly, carefully brought to the surface, DeepScan was directed to explore the passenger cabin. It was a scene of eerie devastation. Seats were torn from their moorings, debris scattered everywhere. Then, the ROV's camera focused on something amidst the tangled wreckage, a guitar case, surprisingly intact, though heavily encrusted with marine growth. It was unmistakably Rick Dagger's iconic Gibson Les Paul case, identifiable by a faded, unique sticker from a small music shop in London he'd visited on their first European tour. The sight brought a fresh wave of sorrow, a stark reminder of the vibrant lives extinguished. Back on land, the black boxes were rushed to the NTSB laboratory in Washington, D.C. The delicate process of cleaning, repairing, and attempting to extract data began. The world waited. Maria Blazikowski held a vigil outside the NTSB headquarters, joined by a handful of aging fans, their faces etched with hope and anxiety. The first breakthrough came from the flight data recorder. Despite some data corruption, engineers managed to retrieve a significant portion of the flight parameters. The data painted a chilling picture. In the final minutes, the Learjet had experienced a sudden, catastrophic electrical failure, followed by a rapid loss of altitude. But there was something else, something that didn't quite fit the profile of a simple mechanical issue. Just moments before the electrical failure, the FDR registered a series of unusual, sharp jolts, almost like impacts, and a brief, inexplicable spike in cabin temperature. Then came the cockpit voice recorder. The initial sounds were mundane. Captain Pierce and co-pilot Sarah Evans running through pre-descent checklists, the faint, distorted sound of music, possibly the Valiants listening to demos of Midnight Reckoning, filtering in from the cabin. Eddie's voice, unmistakable, could be heard laughing at one point. Then the tone shifted. Captain Pierce, what the hell was that? A loud metallic bang is heard, followed by the sound of alarms. Sarah Evans, lost port engine. Electrical fire, Captain. I can smell smoke. Eddie Blaze, voice faint, from cabin intercom. Hey, what's going on up there? We saw a flash outside, like lightning, but different. Captain Pierce, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Niner 400, Victor, X-ray, engine fire, rapid descent. We have, static, a sound of struggle. We're hit again. Unknown voice, distorted, possibly Rick or Tommy. Look out, there's another one. Sarah Evans. It's not lightning. They're firing at us. The last 30 seconds of the recording were a horrifying cacophony of alarms, shouting, the roar of wind, and then an abrupt, final silence. The word firing hung in the air of the NTSB playback room, instantly changing everything. This wasn't just a tragic accident in the Bermuda Triangle. This was something else entirely. Frank Holloway listened, his face grim. The flare sighting by the freighter now took on a terrifying new significance. It wasn't a distress flare from the Valiants. It was potentially the muzzle flash of whatever had attacked them. The impacts registered by the FDR weren't turbulence or exploding engine parts, they were projectiles. Simultaneously, as the CVR's contents were being analyzed, another discovery was made by the team examining the retrieved fuselage fragments and the guitar case. Embedded in a piece of the Learjet's wing, almost invisible beneath layers of corrosion, was a small, irregularly shaped piece of metal. It wasn't part of the aircraft. Preliminary analysis suggested it was a fragment of some kind of ordnance, possibly from a surface-to-air missile. Rick Dagger's guitar case, when carefully opened in a controlled environment, revealed not only his beloved, though severely damaged Les Paul, but also, wedged inside the crushed velvet lining, a small, spent bullet casing. It was brass, .50 caliber. The truth, or at least the horrifying beginning of it, was no longer just an echo, it was a scream from the abyss. The Valiants hadn't just vanished due to mechanical failure or a mythical oceanic phenomenon. They had been attacked, shot down. The mystery of their disappearance had just morphed into something far darker, far more sinister. The questions were no longer about what happened, but who had done this, and why. The memories, painstakingly recovered from the deep, were not of a gentle drift into the unknown, but of a violent, terrifying and deliberate end. The revelation that the Valiant's jet had been shot down sent shockwaves far beyond the NTSB labs and the waiting families. The immediate question on everyone's lips was, who would target a rock band, and why? The Bermuda Triangle theory, so long the convenient shroud, was instantly shredded, replaced by a far more chilling human agency. Investigators, led by Frank Holloway, who was now officially reinstated as a special consultant to a joint NTSB-FBI task force, scrambled to find a motive. Terrorism was considered, but the Valiants, while globally popular, weren't overtly political, and no group had ever claimed responsibility in the intervening 19 years, a hallmark of most terrorist acts. A rogue military exercise gone horribles wrong, possible but hard to prove without some nation stepping forward, however belatedly. The focus inevitably turned towards the music industry itself, a world known for its high stakes, intense rivalries, and occasionally its shadowy underbelly. Had the Valiants, on the verge of releasing Midnight Reckoning and skyrocketing to a new level of fame, become a threat to someone powerful? Marcus Thorne, Jr., CEO of Galaxy Records, publicly expressed horror and disbelief at the new findings, pledging full cooperation. He offered access to all of the Valiant's contracts, financial records, and any correspondence that might shed light on potential enemies. Yet, an undercurrent of unease permeated his carefully crafted statements. Galaxy Records stood to gain significantly from the renewed interest and the eventual release of the lost album, a fact not lost on cynical observers. It was Maria Blazakowski, Eddie's sister, who unknowingly provided the first crucial, seemingly innocuous piece of the puzzle. While sifting through boxes of Eddie's old belongings, things she hadn't had the heart to touch for years, she found a worn tour itinerary for their Blaze Across America tour. Tucked inside was a faded, folded napkin from a New Orleans diner. On it, in Eddie's familiar scrawl, was a name, Silas Blackwood, Seraph Records. Beneath it, a hastily written note, "Wants to buy us out. Offered a fortune. Rick says no way. Something feels off about this guy. Very off." Seraph Records. The name was vaguely familiar to Frank Holloway. In the late 70s and early 80s, Seraph had been a smaller, fiercely ambitious independent label known for aggressively poaching talent and a rumored, though never proven, ruthlessness in its business dealings. Silas Blackwood was its enigmatic founder, a reclusive figure who rarely made public appearances. Seraph Records had eventually folded in the late 1980s under a cloud of financial irregularities, its assets absorbed by larger conglomerates. Blackwood himself had seemingly vanished from the music scene. Holloway tasked a team with digging into Seraph Records and Silas Blackwood. What they found was intriguing. In 1981, Seraph Records had been heavily invested in a band called Crimson Sky, a group with a similar rock aesthetic to the Valiants, but who had consistently lagged behind them in terms of critical acclaim and commercial success. Crimson Sky had been positioned as Seraph's flagship act, their make-or-break investment. The Valiants, with their meteoric rise and the impending release of Midnight Reckoning, represented a direct and formidable competitor. Then came the twist, a piece of evidence from an entirely unexpected quarter. The .50 caliber bullet casing found in Rick Dagger's guitar case, initially thought to be a standard military round, underwent detailed forensic analysis. The casing bore a unique, almost imperceptible microstamp on its base, a tiny, stylized angel's wing. It wasn't a standard military marking. Further investigation revealed that this particular microstamp was linked to a very specific, limited batch of ammunition custom-ordered in the late 1970s by a private security firm called Aegis Protection Services. Aegis, it turned out, had provided security and discreet logistical solutions for several high-profile clients in the entertainment industry. Their client list was confidential, but through a series of carefully pursued leads and a subpoena, and he sees, by the escalating profile of the investigation, one name emerged from Aegis's defunct client roster from 1981, Silas Blackwood, CEO of Seraph Records. The connection was electrifying. Silas Blackwood, whose rival band stood in the shadow of the Valiants, had employed a security firm that used custom-made 50 caliber ammunition, the same type of ammunition that had, according to the CVR and the bullet casing, been fired at the Valiant's jet. The investigators started looking at the flight path of the Valiant's jet and the reported flare sighting by the freighter with new eyes. The Learjet was flying a standard route from Florida to New York. The attack occurred over international waters, making jurisdiction complex. But if it was a planned hit, how was it executed? A 50 caliber weapon could be fired from another aircraft, or, more chillingly, from a suitably equipped ocean-going vessel. The team delved into Blackwood's financials from 1981. They discovered that in the months leading up to the Valiant's disappearance, Blackwood had made several large, untraceable cash withdrawals. Furthermore, shipping manifests from a port in the Gulf of Mexico showed that a privately chartered, nondescript fishing trawler, leased through a shell corporation linked to Seraph Records, had departed for the Bahamas, a route that could easily intersect the Valiant's flight path, a week before the incident, and returned 2 weeks after, its logbook mysteriously blank for the crucial period. The trawler, named the Albatross, was noted in port records as having undergone custom modifications to its deck for specialized equipment just before its departure. The theory began to solidify. Silas Blackwood, facing financial ruin if Crimson Sky failed and overshadowed by the Valiant's imminent superstardom, had orchestrated a desperate, murderous plot. He had chartered a boat, equipped it with heavy weaponry operated by personnel from Aegis Protection Services, and positioned it along the Valiant's flight path. Under the cover of the vast, unpoliced ocean, they had waited. The flare seen by the freighter was likely the muzzle flash of their weapon. They had shot down the Learjet, banking on the Bermuda Triangle's reputation to obscure their crime, ensuring their rival band would never release their new album or eclipse Seraph's flagship act. The motive was no longer abstract industry rivalry. It was concrete, rooted in financial desperation and ruthless ambition. The phantom rival had a name and a face, and the evidence, once buried in the abyss and forgotten files, was now pointing directly at him. The focus of the investigation shifted dramatically from a cold case to a manhunt for Silas Blackwood, a man who had for 19 years gotten away with murder on an almost unimaginable scale, hidden behind a veil of corporate intrigue and the myth of an accursed stretch of ocean. The twist wasn't just that they were shot down, but that the architect of their demise was a figure from their own world, driven by a toxic blend of envy and greed. The hunt for Silas Blackwood became an international media sensation. A man in his late 60s, he had successfully lived under the radar for nearly 2 decades, his past buried deeper than the wreckage of the Valiant's jet. The Albatross trawler had been sold and resold multiple times, its original modifications long since painted over or removed, its logbooks conveniently lost to time. Personnel from the now-defunct Aegis Protection Services proved difficult to trace. Many were either dead, had disappeared, or claimed complete ignorance, their loyalty bought, or their memories conveniently faded. But the forensic link of the micro-stamped bullet casing and the financial trail leading back to Seraph Records provided a compelling, if circumstantial, foundation for the case against Blackwood. Frank Holloway, energized by the pursuit of a truth he had suspected for so long, spearheaded the search. They discovered that Blackwood, after Seraph Records collapsed, had liquidated his remaining assets and, using a series of aliases and offshore accounts, had reinvented himself. He wasn't living in some exotic, remote hideaway, but rather under a new identity, Arthur Swan, a seemingly innocuous retired antiques dealer residing in a quiet, affluent suburb of Vienna, Austria. The image of the ruthless record executive who had allegedly ordered the murder of 4 young musicians and their crew clashed jarringly with the quiet, elderly gentleman who tended his rose garden and frequented local cafes. The Austrian authorities, presented with the evidence compiled by the FBI and NTSB, including the crucial CVR transcripts and forensic reports, cooperated. The arrest of Arthur Swan was low-key, almost anticlimactic. He offered no resistance, his face a mask of mild surprise, as if being confronted with a forgotten, unpleasant dream. But as the charges were read, as the name Silas Blackwood was uttered, a flicker of something cold and calculating passed through his eyes, a brief glimpse of the man he once was. The trial, held in the United States due to the victims being American citizens and the crime originating from American business rivalries, was a media circus. The courtroom was packed daily with journalists, fans of the Valiants, and the families of the victims. Maria Blazakowski sat in the front row every day, her gaze fixed on Blackwood, a silent accuser. Marcus Thorne, Jr. of Galaxy Records, while publicly supporting the prosecution, found his own company under renewed scrutiny for its initial handling of the Midnight Reckoning master tapes and its past dealings. Blackwood's defense attorneys argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the passage of 19 years had made reliable testimony impossible, and that their client was a victim of a sensationalized witch hunt. They painted him as a failed businessman, not a murderer, suggesting the attack on the Learjet, if it indeed happened as described, could have been a tragic case of mistaken identity by drug smugglers or pirates who frequented those waters, a desperate attempt to deflect from the damning bullet casing and financial links. But the prosecution, led by a tenacious assistant U.S. attorney, laid out the case meticulously. The CVR provided the harrowing soundtrack to the jet's final moments. The flight data recorder detailed the impacts. The bullet casing, with its unique microstamp, tied the weapon to Blackwood's known associates. Eddie Blaze's note on the diner napkin provided a clear motive for wanting the Valiants out of the picture. Former employees of Seraph Records, granted immunity, reluctantly testified about Blackwood's increasingly erratic behavior and desperate financial situation in 1981, and his obsessive fixation on the Valiant's success. One key witness, a former bookkeeper for Seraph, produced hidden ledgers showing suspicious payments made to Aegis Protection Services around the time of the disappearance, disguised as artist development fees. The most powerful moment of the trial came when Rick Dagger's damaged Gibson Les Paul, recovered from the wreckage, was presented as evidence. Its scarred body and broken neck, alongside the FD-00 bow, .50 caliber bullet casing found nestled within its velvet lining, became a potent symbol of the violence that had silenced the music. After weeks of testimony and days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: guilty. Guilty on 4 counts of second-degree murder for the band members and 2 counts of second-degree murder for the flight crew. Silas Blackwood, alias Arthur Swan, remained impassive as the verdict was read, but a collective gasp and then quiet sobs of relief emanated from the gallery where the families sat. He was later sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The truth, buried for so long, was finally exposed. It wasn't a mythical sea monster or a freak accident that had claimed the Valiants. It was human greed, envy, and a chilling ruthlessness. The system, which had once been so quick to close the file, had, in the end, been forced to confront its past and deliver a measure of justice, however delayed. In the aftermath, Galaxy Records, under immense public pressure and a desire to right past wrongs, worked with the surviving families and music archivists to painstakingly restore and release Midnight Reckoning. The album, imbued with almost 2 decades of myth and tragedy, was a global phenomenon. Its raw energy, its haunting lyrics about facing darkness, and its intricate musicianship resonated deeply. It wasn't just an album, it was an epitaph, a testament, and a final, defiant chord from a band silenced too soon. The profits from the album were placed into a charitable foundation established in the Valiant's name, dedicated to supporting young musicians and promoting flight safety. Maria Blazakowski, standing outside the courthouse after the sentencing, didn't speak of triumph. She spoke of a heavy peace. "It doesn't bring Eddie back," she told the assembled press, her voice thick with emotion, or Rick, or Tommy, or Johnny, or Captain Pierce and Sarah Evans. "But it means they weren't just a footnote to a mystery. Their lives, their music, it mattered. And now, the world knows why they were taken from us." The case of the Valiants became a stark reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the brightest spotlights. The music of the Valiants lived on, no longer just a soundtrack to a tragedy, but as a symbol of talent, loss, and the eventual, hard-won unearthing of truth. The ocean had given up its secret, and in doing so, had allowed a final, poignant cadenza of justice to be played. The silence that began over the Bermuda Triangle in 1981 was finally, truly, broken.